All right, welcome to today's Explainer. We are unpacking a truly fascinating lecture by Dr. Elaine Phillips on Genesis 3. Now, we're totally moving past the familiar Sunday school version, the one with the shiny red apple and the talking snake. Instead, we're diving deep into the original Hebrew linguistics. And what we uncover here, it is a profound, meticulously detailed tragedy that honestly speaks volumes about human nature. So, standard theology usually frames human history as creation, fall, redemption, right? But Dr. Phillips actually challenges this framework. She prefers creation, corruption, correction. And here's why this matters so much. Think about the word fall. It implies an accident, like you trip over a crack in the sidewalk and you're a little embarrassed. But what happened in the garden? That was absolutely no slip-up. It was a deliberate, step-by-step process of corruption. Okay, let's establish our baseline. We start off in this highly hospitable oasis, a literally perfect environment. There's a huge profusion of water, the tree of life, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But crucially, this garden features absolute egalitarian intimacy. Adam and Eve are side by side, bone of bone, existing in just perfect harmony. Now, this entire drama gets set up by a crazy linguistic double meaning. The text describes Adam and Eve's perfect harmony using the Hebrew word arumim, which means naked and unashamed. But get this, in the very next breath, the exact singular root word, arum, is used to describe the serpent. Depending on the context, arum means crafty, cunning, or wise. So nakedness and craftiness actually share the exact same root word, and both of them can be incredibly beguiling. Of course, every tragedy needs its cast of characters, right? First, we have the crafty serpent, who uses a highly strategic web of deceit. Second, there's Eve. And right alongside her, a crucial detail we almost always miss, is a strangely silent Adam. He is right there during the entire temptation. And finally, the Lord God. Before the corruption actually kicks off, God lays down the ground rules. And honestly, it is a remarkably generous command. God essentially says, hey, I am giving you an entire garden of delight. You are completely free to eat from any tree, except one. It's this massive permission slip, but it comes with a single boundary and a crystal clear warning. Eating from that specific tree brings death. But you've got to wonder, why that specific tree? Like, what does it actually mean to know good and evil? Well, the Hebrew word used here is yada. Dr. Phillips points out that in this context, yada doesn't just mean getting some intellectual fact planted in your head. It means knowing with the clear intent of defining something. It's all about arrogating authority. By taking that fruit, humanity was basically attempting to usurp God's role, taking on the privilege to define morality totally for themselves. And this brings up a genuinely fascinating mystery. God tells them that if they eat the fruit, they will die. But if they are living in a perfect, deathless paradise, how could a threat of death mean anything to them at all? I mean, for a boundary to actually be effective, you have to understand the consequence. So they must have had some sort of prior concept of what death actually was. To solve that mystery, Dr. Phillips proposes a really compelling theological analogy. What if Eden was a perfect, protected oasis that was situated within a world that was already experiencing animal death? Just think about that. Perhaps Adam and Eve could actually look outside their protected garden and physically observe the reality of death in the animal kingdom, which would make God's warning very, very real to them. Now keep God's exact command clearly in your mind. You shall not eat from the tree. Because now we are going to watch exactly how the crafty serpent initiates a deliberate, incredibly insidious web of deceit. He doesn't just attack the rule itself. He distorts the very nature of the lawgiver. Watch the serpent strategy here. It's so sneaky. He takes God's incredibly generous gift, eat from any tree except one, and wildly exaggerates it. He asks, did God really say you must not eat from any tree? It's a completely intentional distortion, perfectly designed to frame God as restrictive, withholding, and stingy. So how does Eve respond? Well, she counters, but she actually introduces her own exaggeration. God said, don't eat. Eve says, you must not eat, and you must not touch it. She builds what scholars often call a fence around the rule, trying to keep people far away from breaking it. While it might have been well-intentioned, this addition fundamentally taints her understanding of God's actual boundary. Sensing the opening, the serpent moves right in for the kill. He just flatly contradicts God, saying, you will not certainly die. And then he appeals directly to human pride. He offers this totally illegitimate shortcut to divine enlightenment, promising that their eyes will be opened and they will literally be like God. He makes the act of rebellion look intellectually and morally attractive. So, the absolutely crucial point is this: sin rarely looks ugly when we're first stepping into it. Convinced by a web of deceit that made rebellion look like a total upgrade, Eve goes through a very deliberate process. She saw it was good, it was pleasing to the eye, it was desirable for enlightenment, so she grabbed it. And Adam, who remember was right there the whole time, completely failed to intervene. He ate it too. And immediately, the tragedy just unfolds. Every single aspect of their harmonious existence is completely torn apart. Driven out of their perfect oasis and into brambles and thorns, they are barred from ever returning. They are suddenly thrust into a harsh, unforgiving new reality. The very first consequence is this sudden, harsh shift in how they perceive things. Remember that word erinim? They were naked and totally unashamed. But now, they perceive their nakedness entirely differently. It's a new kind of nakedness, filled with a desperate insecurity. They feel this overwhelming urge to hide behind wholly ineffective, garden-variety fig leaves. That beautiful intimacy, it's just gone. And then we read this genuinely heartbreaking quote, "I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." Let that sink in. For the first time in history, fear enters the narrative. It creates this vast, seemingly unbridgeable chasm between humanity and God. Fear instantly becomes this powerful, brand new motivator for human behavior, dictating their instinct to just hide from their creator. Following all of this, God steps in and makes a series of sequential pronouncements. He addresses the actors in the exact order of their involvement. First the serpent, then the woman, and finally the man and the ground. Let's briefly break down what these actually mean for the human condition moving forward. First off, the serpent is cursed to crawl on its belly and eat dust. But we need to look past the literal consequence here. A serpent doesn't move in a straight line, right? It twists. This crawling is a perfect, enduring physical metaphor for the evasive, twisting, and devious nature of the deceit that the serpent just introduced into the world. Next up is the pronouncement to the woman, and honestly, the linguistics here are absolutely mind-blowing. God says her desire will be for her husband. Now, we modern readers naturally think of romantic love, right? But Dr. Phillips reveals that this specific Hebrew word is only used 3 times in the entire Old Testament. In the very next chapter, it's used to describe sin crouching at Cain's door, desiring to have him. It doesn't mean romance at all. It means a grasping, clutching urge to master and control. And this brings us to the profound underlying tragedy of Genesis 3:16. That beautiful, completely egalitarian harmony that Adam and Eve once shared in the garden, it is completely shattered. It is tragically replaced by a ceaseless power struggle, a constant relational friction defined by one-upmanship and the innate desire to master one another. Finally, God addresses Adam and the ground itself. The hospitable oasis is entirely replaced by pain, toil, thorns, and thistles. The very ground that Adam was meant to joyfully tend is now cursed. This ensures that human life will be an exhausting struggle that ultimately ends with a return to the exact same dust from which Adam was formed. So as we reflect on this deliberate, deeply tragic corruption, I want to leave you with a provocative thought. Just look at the world around you and even look at yourself. How much of our modern human nature, our drive for mastery, our relational friction, and our constant desire to define our own morality is still deeply rooted in this ancient, tragic choice? It is really something to seriously chew on. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive today, and keep seeking the truth behind the text.